Okay, so now we're going to move forward to our keynote presentation. And I'm not going to read a bio because you can read the bio. It's actually in your program, and Bern can talk a little bit more about that. But as I told you before, in 1987, our first keynote presenter was Jack Dangerman. And Jack was important to seed, the GIS, off-the-shelf type stuff for the state, and that kind of got everybody being able to do the things they needed to do. But this year, at 30 years, what I wanted to do is bring back Esri to talk more about not necessarily, the past, even though I want that, but I think from Bern's perspective, he has a complete understanding of the progression of GIS longer than pretty much anybody there, other than probably Jack and maybe Scott Morehouse and the others. But I do believe that there's a lot happening with GIS in the future, and there was a lot happening in the past. Bern was very, very instrumental in doing things like ArcGIS, very instrumental in doing the first AML interface. Does anybody remember using ArcAML at the time? Right? Okay. And you had to command line everything until you finally got an interface to it, and then all of a sudden your life was a little better. All the way to what's happening now, we've got things like ArcGIS Online, and we have things like story maps, things that are now taking us into the future and just tying all this information together in a visual way. What better person who can speak on this than the person who's actually directly involved in making it happen? So with that was the reason I absolutely insisted that if Bern could come and speak on this was why I wanted him here. So, and he's graciously accepted to do that. So if you could help me welcome Bern Szukalski.
All right, thanks everybody. It's a real privilege for me to be here. When Richard and Felicia approached me at the user conference and asked if I could come, I was absolutely delighted. It's been, I don't know, maybe about 5 years or so since I've been at this event, and I really appreciate this event. I'm really lucky in that I get to travel around to a lot of different user group events, and I think this one is actually very unique. Not only because you've got a strong sense of community, it's really amazing what you do here as a GIS community, but the other thing I really appreciate is that you're willing to step outside the box and innovate and think about things in different ways and really push the boundaries, just like we saw earlier this morning. I really appreciate that, and I think it's a very, very healthy thing, and I think that's what really sets you apart from a lot of the other user group communities. So it's great for me to be here. Jack was here at the first event, and unfortunately he was unable to make it. He's actually keynoting an event in Washington, D.C. at this moment, and but he does extend his regards and his congratulations on your 30th, and I'd like to express my congratulations to you on the 30th as well. Now, I kind of stepped into GIS accidentally. I actually I'm a failed biologist, I'll just admit it publicly, right? So I went to school as a biology major. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I worked for an environmental consulting company for a while. We actually did a little bit of GIS with a planimeter to calculate polygon areas. We did overlays with acetate and that kind of stuff. But I grew up in Pennsylvania, and the job that moved me out to the West Coast was I was doing osteoporosis and vitamin D research. That was the job offer I got, and I moved out to the West Coast, and in 3 months I knew two things quite clearly. One was that I hated my job, and the second was that I loved California. I just really liked it, and part of the reason was I didn't go to a big school. I went to a small school. My parents were immigrants. They knew nothing about careers, and it's a love of a map that brought me to Esri. The first map I fell in love with was a USGS topo map, and what an amazing thing. I could look at it, right? I could fold it up. It fit lots of different form factors. Could take it offline out in the field and edit it, I could put it in a plastic bag. It was portable and waterproof then. So still today, it seems like that's still the gold standard. But anyway, it was that map which led me eventually to Esri. And I came to Esri as a failed biologist and it all started from there. So when Richard and Felicia asked me to do this, a little retrospective of Esri technology, it was a lot of fun for me because I got to go through Esri's archives and take a look at some old photos and reminisce, because a lot of the things that I'll talk about here, this isn't necessarily a history of Esri, it's kind of a history of Esri from my perspective because I've been super lucky to have been involved in some of these different products and technologies. So I found this quote as I was thinking about this, right? Here we are 30 years later. Here I am 31 years later in my career, and many of you are well into your careers. And I saw this quote, all you need is the plan, the roadmap, and the courage to press on to your destination. I've never had that. I don't think anybody has. And certainly in software development, that's just not the way things work. So I like this quote a lot better. It's always under construction. I think that's the really interesting thing about GIS is that it's always under construction. We're always looking for better ways and better things and better capabilities. And I think the exciting part about being in this field is that it's always evolving and always developing. I put together a little timeline of what I think are kind of important things that have happened. And I'm going to highlight just a couple of these. I kind of look at these as the startup years. So I think we can trace certainly commercial GIS all the way back to Roger Tomlinson, who initiated the development of the Canada Geographic Information System, probably the first really well-known example of that, although there were many others. And I'm ignoring a lot of people here that played key roles in the lifting of GIS as a concept and as a science, and even beginning to implement it. So I'm missing a lot here, and I'll apologize to those for that. But another key event was the establishment of the Harvard Lab for Computer Graphics and Spatial Analysis, and that's why Esri was born. And a lot of the people that I work with, a lot of the tenured people I work with, started off there as well. Laurie Jordan, who founded ERDAS, who's now at Esri, he's there. There's many people that have kind of gone through that and have entered the GIS field and made significant impacts. Esri was founded, of course, in 1969. It's interesting that Microsoft was founded in 1975, right? So 6 years later. Apple Computer was founded the year after that. This was an exciting decade to be around in software. And before this, software didn't really exist. There wasn't any notion of software, internet didn't exist, email didn't exist at these times, and it was a really interesting decade for things to happen. One of the things that did happen is at the very bottom, Odyssey GIS, which is generally thought of as the first modern vector GIS, was developed at the Harvard labs, and that's actually the basis for what became known as ArcInfo. I kind of think of this next decade into the 80s as the software years. So IBM came out with the personal computer. Esri launched ArcInfo in 1981. 1986 is when I admitted my complete failure as a biologist and somehow managed to be hired at Esri. I was at the right place at the right time. Esri was in a big hiring moment because we'd just been awarded the contract to automate the entire rail network for the United States for what was called the rail garrison. And back in the day, we used to have nuclear warheads in places all across the US that were stationary. And someone said, hey, let's put them on railroad boxcars, and we can keep them moving all around the United States, and nobody will know where they are except us, and no one will be able to take them out, right? So that was actually one of the big projects that Esri was awarded to automate that and code up that database that ended up kind of sweeping me into the door. But you can see there's lots of other things that happened throughout all of these different years. Some of the things that I've been super fortunate to have been involved with are some of the early days of ArcView and the introduction of Avenue, the first object-oriented scripting language, and map objects and ArcIMS, ArcView IMS, all those products. Milestone there in 1999 where Esri crossed 2,500 employees. So all of these events, these technology events, also pushed forward Esri and Esri's evolution of GIS. It's interesting that right after the dot-com bubble burst that the geography network was born, which some people might argue is the birthplace of what we now know as the Living Atlas or even the GeoWeb, WebGIS. So all of these things have kind of come together over the years, and they're increasingly more rapid, which is what makes such an interesting time today that we live in. So back in 1969, Jack and Laura founded Esri in their hometown of Redlands. They had, of course, Jack went to Harvard with a lot of other people that ended up working at Esri. Hugh Keegan, who was my first boss, was also there. Scott Morehouse spent some time at the Harvard lab, and in 1969 the company was founded, but it wasn't software. Software didn't really even exist. There were computer programs which ran on mainframes and mini-computers, but software didn't exist. There was no such market. And it was really an idea at Harvard that led Jack and Laura to start this company. And on the left there is the original building. It's now a beauty salon, but it's still there on 5th Street in Redlands. And there's some old photographs of Jack, and there's Laura in the bottom right there with Mike Lawrence and Jack. And they were really consultants, and consulting for land use and analysis, not a software company, but they did develop software for users. So Grid in 1969 was developed, followed soon by Grid Topo, and Pios, which was an early forerunner to ArcInfo. That was built in 1970 for the San Diego Comprehensive Planning Commission. And it was kind of through those engagements that Esri began thinking about developing software. But prior to then, this is in 1974, this is the New York Street campus where Esri is today, was sort of lifting. This used to be just Redlands was big in citrus, and these used to be citrus groves and just fields. And Jack bought the first buildings. They're actually recycled buildings, which is a great idea. They were bank buildings in Huntington Beach. And he bought the buildings and trucked them up and put them on this property. Those buildings still exist today. The framework is still all original. The only thing that happens is every now and then the skunks and possums underneath it get cleaned out, and the building will get a fresh coat of paint, but it's still there today. So those were the first buildings that arrived on the campus. Now, from some of the early brochures I went back, I saw some of these interesting pictures. Kent Smith, many of you don't know, but he's a very important player behind the scenes. He's a professor at the University of Redlands, a biology professor, and he's been a consultant to Esri for a long time. Bill Derenbacher, he is our Director of Professional Services, recently stepping aside from that. And then, of course, Jack, the color picture is Jack, Logan Hardison, who ran the operations, Scott Morehouse with a shorter and less gray beard there, and S.J. Camarada, who's still with the company as well. He was the first director of marketing at Esri. Now, back when I started in 1986, this was state-of-the-art hardware. And some of you old-timers here remember this. And this was really heady times. I remember I got, my first computer was a Trash 80, right? The Radio Shack TRS 80. And I came to Esri, and wow, I looked at this stuff, and there were these prime mini computers and these tape reels and things like that. And monitors didn't really exist. Well, you had monitors, but you didn't have like what we have today, right? I used to sit in front of an ARC prompt, non-graphic monitor, and type in commands. That's kind of what I first did. But then I remember when the first graphic monitors started showing up, the Tektronix ones. If you were a digitizer at Esri, you digitized using a Selenar monitor. It was kind of like an orange and black screen thing. And these were kind of heady days. I have to tell you a little funny story about that tape there. On one early project, and I won't name the contractee, Esri was going to be late for a delivery date, and we had to automate this data for them. And Jack had to hit this delivery date to get paid. These were very lean years where if we didn't get a contract, Jack couldn't make payroll. So I remember Jack says, well, just get a bunch of tapes together and we'll put them in a box and we'll send it to them. And that way we'll meet the contract deadline, and by the time they figure out that we didn't send them the right stuff, we'll have everything completed and we'll ship the new stuff. So my colleague, Hugh Keegan, and also a good friend, he showed Jack this box, and Keegan with these reel tapes in it, and so Jack looked at it, and Hugh said, well, what do you think, Jack? And Jack's like, not enough tapes, put some more tapes in there and ship it off. So that's how things kind of went back in the day. It's our little secret. I've been fired twice. This conference could mean the reason for my third firing. Now, when I started off under what's called a fast track processor. So back in the day when I started, people would have to digitize. They'd be changed to a digitizing tablet for like 6 months to a year before they could even do anything else, before you could even snap nodes in ArcEditor. So that's actually what I did. My first 2 weeks at Esri were digitizing. And those that ever did that, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, right? And a 3 was for a curve. And then you could have a little coding sheet. This is also back in the day where a lot of data was scanned. It didn't exist. We didn't have the luxury of ready-to-use living atlases and things like that. So everything had to be automated. This was super, super time-consuming and super, super expensive. But that's actually how I started, is digitizing. Now, in 1981, Esri had its first conference, and there were 16 attendees. And actually, there were, let's see who was there. Dale Honeycutt just recently retired at Esri. Some of you may have known Dale. He was an original network programmer, so he was working for Woodward Clyde. Earl Nordstrand retired just recently as well, and he was with the Minnesota State Planning Agency, one of the pioneers. And there's other people whose names you might remember. Larry Sugarbaker, who's had a tenured career in the U.S. government and with NatureServe and other fine organizations. So these were the original attendees. The first conference, of course, was on the Esri campus at the time. And the dinner was at Gigi and Jean's, which was a little French restaurant right on the corner where, if you've ever been to campus, Bengerong is now there, another nice restaurant. So 1986 was the first conference off campus, and that was at the San Bernardino Hilton. That was the first conference I went to. And I think there were about 200 people there. It was huge. And Palm Springs Convention Center happened the year after that, the Wyndham in Palm Springs in 1987. And since 1997, of course, the Esri conference has been in San Diego. 1982 was the big year, so ArcInfo 1.0 was released. And it was called ArcInfo because it represented geographic features as arcs, and it combined that with a relational database, which came from a company called Henco. And their database was Info. So that's how we got arc/info, all caps, as the original product. The first customer was actually New Brunswick Forestry, according to what I've been able to dig up. And ArcInfo 1.0 took 9 months to develop by 4 programmers. And it was based on that Odyssey product that was developed at Harvard at the time. And it more or less answered the question, if you were going to reinvent Odyssey, what would you do? And that's really how ArcInfo started. It was a toolbox with a command line interface. It introduced something called the coverage data format, and it was the first GIS to take advantage of the super minicomputers at that time, Prime and VAX and DG. And there in that kind of oldish looking photo was the 1985 development team. Dave Bishop, who's still a GIS consultant, is on the left. Mark Oliver, who used to be our DG platform programmer. Glenn Huprexy, he was our Prime guy, and he just recently quit. Peter Aronson is the guy with the beard in the front. He's still at Esri. Scott Morehouse, Tony Lupian, who unfortunately died early on. But Tony did our network product. And there's Bill Moreland, who still works at Esri today, and Armando Guevara, who's still in GIS. So these were the originators of the product, and they're still around and involved in this. On the right there is one of the first ArcInfo maps, very simple, but that was how it all started. Now, coverages were kind of a really cool and radical thing. They stored topology. So you knew, a polygon knew what arcs made it up, and it knew what was on the other side of that. It knew what its neighbors were, so it explicitly defined those spatial relationships and stored that in the data itself. And at the time, that was a really big deal. And years later, we would come out with a shapefile, which didn't store topology, but that was because computing and power, our technology had advanced, that we could build topology on the fly at that time. I remember that was our big mantra with shapefiles. But this was a really big deal, is to introduce this topology into the data itself, and that's actually what propelled ArcInfo further. Now, in 1986, PC ArcInfo was released, and one of the things it's famous for is for the ever unpopular dongle that had to come along with that product eventually. This was developed for DOS 3.1 at the time. And actually, I never really used it much because at the time PCs were not adequately powerful to do the big GIS stuff that we had to do. So I pretty much ignored the whole early PC revolution at Esri, but of course these are ubiquitous today and have changed the landscape of computing as we know it. This also introduced something called SML, the simple markup language, which was how you customized PC ArcInfo. Now, in the late 1980s was the advent of Unix workstations, and I still remember clearly the day that a first Sun workstation, Sun Microsystems workstation, showed up at Esri. We gathered around it. It was like, wow, look at this thing, right? Because in the back room were the prime mini computers, and here's this workstation that was even more powerful, that had a great graphics terminal, and oh my gosh, it was just an amazing thing. And that's actually what I focused my early career on, was on workstation ArcInfo and working with that. And there were a lot of other companies involved in that as well. Silicon Graphics, now gone, which is actually where the Google campus is. I remember years ago going first to the Google campus, and there's this kind of funny, kind of blue, purpley building, and I recognized it actually from a Silicon Graphics brochure. So kind of like hermit crabs, right? One left the shell and another one kind of waltzed in and grew a little bit bigger then, of course. But it was just interesting to see these things evolve over time. Now, as Richard mentioned, ArcInfo was all command line interface, but you could kind of customize it. So the mini computers had their own little languages. Primos, the operating system on the Prime, had something called CPL. On the VAX machines, had DCL. So there are a number of kind of ways that you could kind of store commands and play them back. And that's how we used to do it. There was something called ArcLib, which was the Fortran libraries for ArcInfo. I used to work with those. I was a great Fortran programmer, I think, because I think so linearly. Right? I was never really good at C++ and all that other stuff so much, but that just totally made sense to me. And of course, you could program in info as well. There was something called odd and even programming sections that you could leverage, and it would control how things iterated through your code. It was kind of interesting stuff. But then along came Arc Macro Language, AML. And AML was actually based on CPL, and a gentleman named Eric Weitzman, who I've just recently connected with on LinkedIn. Eric took CPL and modeled AML after that, and then that's how it all started. Now, originally it was a cross-platform way to record the Arc commands, but then it became visual. So he developed and evolved a visual interface, and you were able to create menus. I actually found some of the old design documents and scanned them from, I used to be involved in developing ArcTools, which was the first menuing interface to ArcGIS. I remember at the time Clint Brown was proposing we call this the Arc Productivity Menu System, ArcPMS. And he actually had this document introducing the notion of ArcPMS, and he'd say, yeah, ArcPMS, what's it to you? But that was the early origins of the first visual interface to ArcInfo, and that's a really great example of that. You could do amazing things with this, amazing things, and it was just a really fun language to work in, and you could build some really, really neat things. So that's how it all started, and of course originated with the CPL. But in addition to that, you still had these great command line interfaces with the hashtags. We used to call them pounds, right? Clean Europe, pound, 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 poly. And that was, you'd walk away from that, let it run for an hour or two, and hope it would finish by the time you got back from lunch. Also around this time, you know, Jack, of course, is the primary evangelist for Esri technology and ArcGIS, and Jack always had slides with them, right? And he certainly kept the local company in business, the local photo lab. And Jack would have trays and trays and trays full of slides, and those of you that have known Jack for a long time can recall him walking around with his little, you know, briefcase with these slide trays tucked in it, and just a bunch of slides, and you know, Jack would be sorting things out right before a presentation, and invariably a couple would be upside down, till finally someone decided, let's put them in right side up, and we'll like draw on the top of them, you know, so that Jack can actually have a visual cue as to how to put them in the right way. So But what's interesting, I actually went back and found some old scans of his slide. These are vintage slides. These go back into the 80s and early 90s. It's interesting that some of the messages that he talks about today are some of the very same messages that he was introducing way back then. A notion of intelligent GIS and intelligent maps and opening up GIS to everything. So sometimes these things sound new to us, but they've been evolving for many decades, and the technology has changed underneath to support that. Esri t-shirts are always kind of fun, and this was the first Esri t-shirt. I actually still have one of these. It's kind of beat up, but this is the original, actually the second Esri logo and the first Esri t-shirt. The total geographic information system, of course, those of you that have been to conferences know about lots of other types of t-shirts. Also in 1987 is when Jack first spoke at this conference. And this is Richard's photo of Jack, a younger Jack Dangerman speaking here in front of this organization. And here you are 30 years later. Throughout the years, we've had various user conference logos. My favorite is still the first one in 1989, kind of like a hippish kind of California thing, I guess. But there's a long evolution of the different artwork. Jack always was directly involved in approving the artwork, and it certainly had a certain style and a look and a brand that he really liked. For those of you that have been to some of our conferences, you know that there have been some amazing keynote speakers over the years. Jane Goodall was, of course, at one. Ralph Nader spoke at one of the early conferences. Michael Fay, who's been known for doing that transect, his march across Africa, barefoot for the most of it, going through intense jungle to reach the shoreline. He spoke at one of our conferences. Peter Hillary, Sir Edmund Hillary's son, spoke at one of our conferences. Waldo Tobler. I remember Waldo was especially interesting to me because he did his whole presentation using a potato and aluminum foil and these old acetate overhead slides. He did that at our user conference and talked about topology. I thought that was really cool. Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan political activist since past, she was there. And lots of really interesting people. Some of you might remember in 2013 that Will.i.am showed up at one of our conferences. I wish I could get my hair to do that. This was actually a pretty big event, you know, and even at Esri, it's like, wow, Will.i.am, he's actually coming to our conference. And many of you know that Will.i.am had this band called the Black Eyed Peas, and after he showed up at our conference, there was a lot of speculation about maybe Jack joining the band and doing the Jack-Eyed Peas. And, but of course that didn't happen, and Jack stayed on with GIS. 1991, head of years, ArcView 1.0, which was an amazing product, really was. A lightweight GIS, right? The first departure from ArcInfo. It was built for workstations on Neuron data technology. That's what provided the interface. And it shipped an unprecedented 10,000 copies in the first 6 months of 1992. So a wildly popular product. Then it sort of went back to the drawing board. So after the release of ArcView 1, it took another 3 years to rethink the product and build ArcView 2. And during that time, the core development team was centered in Montague, Massachusetts, at a place called the Book Mill. So they just had a couple of offices there, and the slogan for the Book Mill was, "Books you don't need in a place you can't find," which I think is awesome. But ArcView then introduced shapefiles, which of course are ubiquitous in the GIS landscape today. And it also introduced Avenue. I was the Avenue lead at the time, and it was an object-oriented scripting language, and it actually opened up the platform for partners and developed. It was really cool. ArcView also introduced some really innovative things like the model builder, a visual way to do GIS analysis and modeling, which made that a very powerful platform. Now, back in 1996, actually it was myself and Jeff Jackson and Matt McGrath, we're all still at Esri. Microsoft had invented this architecture called COM, and there were things called components that developers could use to build their own custom stuff. And we thought, you know, we should do like some map objects and kind of sell that. And we proposed that to Jack and Scott and Clint, and you know, Esri's a privately held company. We're not driven by, you know, other incentives or other things, and they thought about it and says, yeah, you guys go ahead and do that. So 1996, we lifted Map Objects, which was a very revolutionary product for its time. It was intended for Windows developers and offered these COM-compliant tools and components for people to build their own applications with. Now, a little known fact is that Map Objects was the first internet technology from Esri. So we called it IMS, the Internet Map Server, and Mo Map Objects, Mo IMS became the first internet platform from Esri, and it was partially in response to some competitive pressure that we had from Autodesk, who had also introduced internet mapping capability. And this is old technology stuff. Request from a client, the map would be generated on the server and then sent back to the client. Really slow, really hinky, but it was the first step. 3 months later, ArcView IMS was announced. That was an extension for ArcView, and thus began sort of the underpinnings or the very beginnings of WebGIS. Now, we all know how important that is to all of us today. It's really difficult to even think of when it begins. I found slides of mine going back to 2005, and that's only because I only archive them back to then, that talk about that. But certainly, you know, Jack's slides, even many years before that, talk about this GIS moving to the internet and the GeoWeb and Web 2.0, all those things kind of coming together. So a lot of times we think of this as revolutionary stuff, but it's been evolving for many, many decades. In 2000, ArcIMS 3 was released. That was the first release of the product. It was preceded by something called, I might get this wrong, as I recall, it was the GIS Data Server. And there was a guy named Mike Tate who worked in our professional services department that had a lot of customers where Mo IMS and ArcView IMS didn't cut the mustard for him. So they evolved this as a more powerful server for the internet, and out of that we grew ArcIMS, the commercial offering for that. So that's how ArcIMS started, and there were lots of interesting things that you could see. You can recognize these early maps as ArcIMS maps easily with that standard toolbar and very easy to pick out from the crowd. In 2000, the Geography Network started, and originally was meant to open up GIS data to others. People would contribute, you could search for things, and you could download the data, and you could even look at some maps through something called ArcExplorer Web Services Edition, which was actually built on Map Objects. And the Geography Network lasted for a long, long time. It was launched in 2000 and retired in favor of ArcGIS Online years later. Now, a lot of people think of ArcGIS Online as our kind of first commercial web offering, but before that we had this thing called Arc Web Services. And this was based on and introduced GIS users to things like SOAP, XML, WSDLs, Web Services Definition Languages, and UDDIs, all these kind of odd little acronyms that were part of web services at that time. And Arc Web Services were commercial offerings. You could subscribe to these, you'd pay for the services. Sometimes we bundled little apps with them to do little functional things. There was a toolbar for ArcMap users, and this entire thing was built using ArcIMS and ArcSTE. So this was really the very beginnings of a true web GIS from Esri. Now, 2006 was a really big year. It was kind of the year of virtual globes, as we used to call them. So Skyline had one. Google Earth, of course, had one. And that was when Google bought Keyhole. And NASA Whirlwind was another one that was around at that time. And sort of in response to that popularity of these things and the awakening of GIS or geography in terms of these globes and these products that were free, you didn't have to pay for them, you could just download them and use them, a group of us started building ArcGIS Explorer Desktop, which to this day, I think, is the best product Esri ever developed for a lot of reasons. It was a 2D and 3D experience, so they combined that. It was tapped into ArcGIS Online, so it leveraged content from that. It leveraged content from your own servers, had these little things that we called pop-ups that you could click, and you could show everything from HTML pages to movies to anything in those little pop-ups, and it was free on top of it. It was meant to sort of be a free client that would help push out all of the hard work that GIS people were doing to a much broader audience, and it was wildly, wildly popular. The first release was actually in late November of 2006, but it was a little shaky, so it was quickly followed by another release. We used to name them by the release numbers or the build numbers, 350 in 2007. So that was it. It's still a great product, and there's actually still a couple of people around the planet that still use this. It was also the first one to be extensible, so you could customize it and extend it, and it also was the first Esri product to embrace the ribbon user experience. So that was a big innovative product. In 2007, ArcGIS Online emerged, and there's some snapshots of some old interfaces to that. When it was first introduced, it didn't have a map viewer. It was just like a better geography network. But then we introduced the map viewer and introduced something called Explorer Online, and that's how things kind of lifted. And of course, many of you in this room are leveraging ArcGIS Online and what it's come to represent, much more than just a repository, but an entire online ecosystem for leveraging GIS. And one of, I think, the more important things that it developed or it promoted was the notion of configurable apps. Now, clearly, talented programmers are essential to doing some incredible things, but this was the first way that mere mortals could be empowered to build applications. So this, I think, was a revolutionary sort of notion, and in 2007, we started developing these configurable application templates. You didn't need to be a programmer, and you could just kind of configure these and go. And of course, that notion has kept on today through things like the web app builder and the JavaScript templates and other things which we're going to be revealing here in the future. So let's see, in 2017, another big year here, Donald Trump's first tweet as president, right? So there it is. And also, a little known fact, 2017 was Jack Dangermond's first tweet. And you can see here, right? GIS is evolving, and IoT will be pervasive and make planet better. Billions will benefit. Societal GIS, huge. Of course, I'm only kidding. Jack does not, thankfully, tweet. But I thought if he did, that would be pretty representative of that. So. It's been a pretty amazing journey that all of us really have been on, regardless of when you started your path down the road. But even since the very beginning, it's always been about the map. So this is early documentation, 1982, and the handwriting there, the little sketch, the diagram, is Scott Morehouse's handwriting. He's still the director of software development, or still involved with software development. And even back then, you can see it was all about maps. A GIS is a set of tools for managing and analyzing maps. A map is the basic unit of information in a GIS, and a user works with a GIS by applying processes to maps. So maps are it. They are the lingua franca, the visual language for everything that we do, and maps have just gotten so much more better and so much more powerful, and enable us to do some really amazing things these days. So my first technical benchmark for Esri, my task, one of the tasks that they challenged Esri to do was I had to shade all the soils polygons coded 3G green and plot it out on Mylar. That was the big task. Now when you think about what we ask of a GIS, it's really remarkable, and it's because of the way the technology has evolved, the way our databases, the way we even represent our digital twin, our world today, how we do that has evolved, and that makes us set GIS onto some pretty amazing tasks. Now my biology professor, the one that really got me sparked up about biology, used to tell me science will save us. And I think as a GIS person now, I think the science of where that GIS can save us. It certainly helps us in the face of disasters, mitigate and assist those responses. We've got lots of problems that we need to deal with. You know, the Edwards Aquifer and climate change and all this stuff we have to deal with. I think that GIS, the science of where, is what will propel us to discover those answers, to become smarter and more sustainable and more resilient. So this was actually a quote I found in one of Jack's slide decks. So I think he thought this was important. I think all of you that have been here and involved with this organization for a long time would agree that success, the price of success, is hard work, dedication, unremitting devotion to the things you want to see happen. And I think many of you represent that in terms of your success as the Texas GIS organization. What I'd like to do is maybe leave you with just a little demonstration of some interesting things which are kind of happening. So let me show you the power of maps and where we are today with maps. Now this is the Indiana Department of Transportation. And what they've done is they've built a map that gets smarter all the time. So they're using machine learning to drive intelligence into this map every, actually 3 hours it's updated. So as I zoom in, there's a little 1 kilometer grids, and they indicate the probability of accidents happening within those grids. And I can look forward here, so we can take a look at that, look at it in the next set of 3 hours. Here's 3 to 6 p.m. It's kind of interesting, some of these, like you think that the later at night, the more chance for accidents because of whatever, bars closing or something, but it's not often the case. And as we zoom in, we'll actually see the crash locations, and we can interact with those and gain more information. Now on the back end, what you don't see, but what's really cool about this, the machine learning part, is that this is constantly being updated. As crash events occur, they're being compiled, the entire database is being updated, and it shuffles over every 3 hours. So it's learning and becoming more smart as we go. That's a really interesting trend. The other thing about maps is that they're becoming a whole lot more powerful. And this is going to take a second to pop up. I didn't cache this purposefully because I wanted you to see this. So these are actually properties, building footprints in Manhattan. There's over 1 million features in this feature layer. And those of you that work with ArcGIS Online today know that you can't look at that many features at once. Well, you can. This has just been released in our JavaScript API. And you can see we can retrieve information like that. And we can also animate this. And we're looking at the years at which these buildings have been constructed in a little window moving through time. And you can see how quickly that's responding. So this is over 1 million features. So our ability to handle these massive amounts of data that we have to deal with today is increasing all the time. So I'm looking forward to this coming up in the map viewer in ArcGIS Online, of course. Let's move on to point clouds. And there's lots of ways to get point clouds now, drones, LiDAR devices, and things like that. One of the really interesting things about these is that they can handle huge volumes of information. So this is Barnegat Bay, and as I zoom in, you'll see the actual points there. And as we zoom in, we're getting more resolution, so we're resampling. And you can see we've got a pretty realistic depiction of the town here. Based on all of these points that are in this cloud. And at the user conferences here, we actually worked with a data set and showed one that had 4 billion points in it. So our ability to work with massive amounts of data is only increasing. Another place that maps are taking us is indoors. And this is an example from the University of Kentucky. This is building information management. And there's one of the campus buildings. Oh, there we go. And of course, I can turn off some of these layers. I'm using this in the scene viewer. And let's go ahead and turn on some of the furniture. So the desks and the floor slabs and the beams, and we can kind of zoom on in. I'll zoom on in this way. All right, so we can take a look at things and manage using GIS infrastructure and buildings, and even some more mundane things like chairs and desks and things like that. But this is a rapidly growing area as well. And so is live crime or crime in 3D. We're back to Manhattan. This data is coming from the New York City Open Data site, and it's been animated to show the occurrence of crimes over different periods of time within a 500-meter radius of the location that's on the map. And I can kind of click on another location here, and I can set that as the new, and it's going to tap in to that crime data and then build a little 3D model to show us where the crime is happening. So this is kind of cool too, our ability to visualize all of this in much better ways. The Internet of Things is big these days, right? And this is an amazing example, I think. The data is published in an open data site by the city of New York. And one of my colleagues kind of tapped into that data. And we're looking at live traffic. Actually, the white dots don't represent traffic speed. They just kind of are a nice little animation. But that's traffic conditions. And I can kind of come here and take a look at what's happening in New York. You can see traffic's pretty heavy right now. And the average mile per hour is 0. And that's because it's all stop and go traffic, right? Block by block by block. And there's tons of traffic monitors, as you can see. And I got to go through a lot until I get to semi-heavy traffic. And there it is, kind of like in the outskirts there. So this is pretty neat. And this is just tapping into these sensors that are providing these live traffic reports. And we can kind of visualize these and rotate around and take a look at them. That's really neat stuff. But there's other things that we can look at as well. Here's the traffic cameras throughout the city. So I can click on the traffic cam and you'll see there's little cars going by as I choose these different traffic cams located throughout the city. So being able to see what's happening at any moment is really, really a cool thing. This also extends to accidents. So let's take a look at what it was like today for pedestrians. I often wonder about Californians going to New York and stepping out into traffic without looking and getting run down. But this is actually the live database which shows the accidents. So there was an injury there. One of the pedestrians got probably clipped by a car. There's another one. That's kind of a little morbid. Let's do something a little nicer. So air quality. Let's look at the air quality in New York, and it looks like the particulates are pretty good at 10 today. But a great example of pulling in all these live feeds and doing things. Story maps are probably the biggest thing that's happened, certainly at Esri, to expand the ability of people to take their maps out to a broader audience. And I just found this one the other day. This is using a story map cascade, and it's got a cool little video which helps us understand a little bit about retreating ice at the poles. I've got a little story maps workshop coming up here this afternoon too, so a little pitch for that. But this is kind of neat because it can use all these powerful maps that we can now make, and we can kind of add them to our stories and help tell some really interesting stories about what we do or what's happening on our planet. And finally, one of the great things that's starting to happen is that maps and GIS are really engaging communities and the public. Los Angeles was an early adopter of this concept, which is called a hub. And this is their ArcGIS online homepage. And one of the places I can go is their open data site. So they're strong proponents of pushing data out for public consumption. What this architecture allows them to do is accomplish initiatives. So these are goals that the city has, and they're using maps and GIS to not only engage citizens, but also to track progress and to inform what's going on. And one of their initiatives is Vision Zero. And this kind of started, I believe, in Sweden or somewhere, the idea that there should be no traffic deaths throughout the city. So we've got a little chart that helps us kind of see what's going on, but we also use the power of maps to show what's happening in the city, to engage the public, and to help provide broader understanding. So there's that little live map coming up which shows what's happening. So this, I think, is the next frontier for GIS, is engaging more than just fellow GIS people, but reaching out, engaging the public at large, the citizens of the world, to help us solve the important problems that we face today. So with that, again, congratulations on your 30th, and I look forward to seeing you throughout the conference. Thanks.
Do you have time for some questions?
Yeah.
Okay, we have some time for anybody who has some questions for Bern. Anybody? Surely you got to have questions about this, really. Anyone? Well, I do actually have one question for you, Bern. One thing that is very important to us, to make something like this happen, obviously takes a lot of coordination, let's say, with others. One thing that myself and I'm fortunate to have our state data coordinator here, Ed Kelly, is with us too. One of the big things is about sharing information. So can you talk a little bit about how critical just being able to share and move information between agencies and whatever is to making things like this a reality?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Richard. I think, you know, years ago, the problem with GIS data was that only GIS people had access to it. And the way that we started making people more aware of the results of our hard work or analysis or something was we'd make a paper map. That was kind of the way things started. But the data that we work with, the data that we nurture, the analysis that we do is no more valuable than our ability to share it with a wider audience. And that includes the public, but it also includes fellow GIS users. So one of the great things I think that's happened during my tenure in this technology is that there have been a lot of really neat ways that people have opened up their data and understood through the common foundation of standards the importance of interoperability. And I was involved at the fringes of the Hurricane Harvey response. And I think it's in times like those that really becomes clear. The ability for agencies, cities, local government, FEMA, for those to provide authoritative content that can help mitigate the effects of a natural disaster like that is just amazing when that data can be pushed out and people can find it and do incredible things with it. And I think that's actually a new role that we have as GIS professionals. I remember years ago, people were concerned as WebGIS lifted. I talked to this one fellow at a conference. He says, Bernie, he says, I make the maps. I don't want anybody else to make a map, right? This was that old notion of, hey, GIS people, we own the data, we make the maps. No one else can make a map. And of course, I think we've freed ourselves from the chains of that thinking, and that's what's enabled us to rethink what we do as GIS professionals and reimagine what's possible by opening up our data and sharing it and working collaboratively.
Great. Yeah, Peter.
You mentioned the machine learning and AI applications in the Indiana website.
Mm-hmm.
More broadly, what do you think the future for that holds as it relates to GIS and opportunities there?
Okay, so the question was about the Indiana machine learning and what does that hold for the future of GIS. You know, I wish I could tell you that I'm this great visionary. I'm so totally not, right? Remember, I'm a failed biologist. Mm-hmm. But what I think is that there are people in this room that understand the potential of applying technology like that to data and what it can mean in terms of making forward-looking decisions. One thing that I've seen is that GIS used to be good for capturing history. Today, we can capture what's happening right now, but even more importantly, we're adding in the forward-looking capabilities into our data and into our systems. And that ability to look forward and forecast, think about the what-ifs and look forward, I think that's the next big area for GIS. Lately, there's been a lot of hype about something called a digital twin. And I don't know, Forbes had a lot of rah-rah about that, and Gartner rated that one of the top 10 technologies for this decade. And I remember when I thought about that, I thought, digital twin, I said, GIS people have been making digital twins since the dawn of GIS. But when we used to make our digital twin, when we captured our universe digitally, we did that really simply using points, lines, and polygons. And then we got networks, and then now there's all these sensors and live feeds and models. So our ability to capture our digital twins is really greatly increased, and I think using things like machine learning and this ability to capture reality and not just look at what's happening, but look at what might happen moving forward, I think that's the real groundbreaking place that GIS will make a difference.
One more question, anybody?
Sorry, you didn't hear anything about?
You didn't cover anything about ArcGIS Pro?
Okay,
ArcGIS Pro.
ArcGIS Pro. It was noted that it was a gap in my presentation here. Actually, it's because of me. And the reason is that I've actually been more interested in technology that reaches a broader audience than GIS professionals. There's plenty of people that do that at Esri. I've always been interested in things that reach out of the GIS box and reach a broader audience. ArcGIS Pro clearly is the flagship GIS desktop you know, in any sense of the word today, and it's certainly a major focus of Esri's development teams. But well before Pro lifted, I became involved in ArcGIS Online, and that to me was really exciting because you could reach a broad audience, right? Pro is clearly for GIS professionals, but it's the most powerful platform that exists, integrates with the web, and it's a great way to push out some really amazing things through that. But that's why I didn't mention it. I'll add the slide next time.
Well, so Bern, you're going to be around for a while. You said
Yes.
you're doing a little thing. So if anybody has any questions, Esri booth, Bern will be around there or tooling around. So please feel free to stop by and ask questions. So thank you again very much.
Thanks. Thank you all. And congratulations.
Thank you. So we're going to take a break.